Our next speaker is Dr. Colin Roberts. His current position is Associate Professor of Pediatrics and Neurology at Oregon Health Sciences University, Dornbecker Children's Hospital. Dr. Roberts completed his child neurology residency and epilepsy fellowship at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, and then was recruited by OHSU to begin the Dornbecker Childhood Epilepsy Program, which he has directed for the past 18 years. His major clinical interests are in comprehensive epilepsy care, including epilepsy surgery, along with clinical trials of investigating, is that novel therapies for childhood seizures. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Colin Roberts.
Thanks, everybody. It's just a pleasure to be here. Can everybody hear me with this? I see so many familiar faces, and I know many of you probably have some degree of familiarity, either by choice or not, with this topic. And what I wanted to talk about today is kind of give you a sense of the state of our understanding medically about where we are with this and where we could go and where we should go and what we have to deal with, because this is something which is here and has potential benefits, and it's certainly not going away. And this has been a really unique kind of situation. I guess I should go through first and kind of say, I have no disclosures relevant to this, although I do clinical research trials at OHSU with some of the firms which do manufacture cannabis and cannabis products. So this has really been something that, if you will, was kind of thrust upon us in the medical community. We were kind of sitting around innocently not thinking about this, while everybody else had been thinking a lot about this. And the way that this came to us was really through this tremendous enthusiasm and momentum through our patients and families who would come to us and say, well, why don't you know about this? I mean, it's cannabis. Everybody knows about cannabis. And we were kind of left saying, well, but we really don't. And how do we respond to that? Do we say, don't talk to me about that? Do we say, go away and meet somebody else who wants to tell you about that? But who would that person be? Do we say, I'm going to call Child Protective Services because you're giving this product to your child? What do we do as doctors, and certainly as pediatricians, who really, our primary responsibility is to our kids, and we're there to protect them, and how do we help them move forward? And certainly this has been a huge issue for us. So the way that this first came about, and really came to the attention of a lot of people in the epilepsy field, was in a very interesting way. If you look here, this is an article in Epilepsy, which is one of our main journals. And frequently these are written by scientists, and then we recently started putting their pictures up there as well. So this is Ed Ma, who's down in Colorado, who was writing about this, and he was writing basically some anecdotes about this child, Charlotte Phoebe, who has Dravet syndrome and who had benefited from a cannabis product. Many of you might be familiar with Charlotte's Web that's being sold by the Stanley Brothers out of Colorado, but that was actually named after Charlotte. What's really interesting about this article, though, is that in addition to Dr. Ma, his co-author was actually Charlotte's mother. And this really doesn't happen often, that you have a patient or a patient's family involved in the scientific dissemination of information. And this was really quite unique, and I think it speaks to the passion with which people have come to this and the need for us to really try to resolve what the real story here is, because I think there's been a lot of passion and excitement and hope, and we are still trying to catch up with the real information to be able to tell you what that means. I think that Dr. Bell mentioned already probably the only other situation I could think of where a parent wrote about epilepsy, and this of course was Dr. West, talking about West syndrome and infantile spasms back in the 1840s. You can see his very passionate note here that the case I've witnessed in my own child is to be very grateful to any member of the profession who can give me any information. So you think about the passion that you read about in a medical journal, not just the data coming forward from a scientific study, but this message from a parent or a patient themselves saying, please, this is something that we really need. And that's been unique to this topic. Now, how we've been able to try to approach this has been through some very important ways, which may seem quite tedious and overdue to many of you, but I'm here to give you a little bit of an update on that. So like a lot of things that were first perhaps investigated and tried out in the East, the way that this came to us in Western medicine was through physicians and perhaps other people that went out and tried to look in these areas and learn from there. So actually, if you go all the way back to the 15th century, there actually is a note of the Caliphate counselor in Baghdad using hashish to treat his son with seizures. So this idea that cannabis could be used for epilepsy, and not just epilepsy, but epilepsy in children, it's actually not a new idea. Now, whether you make much of this the case report. It's neither here nor there, but this does go back. A lot of the publicity about this, though, came down to this gentleman, W.B. O'Shaughnessy, who was an Irish physician, actually, who was in India, and he published this paper in the Transactions of Medical and Physical Journal of Bengal in 1839. It's actually before Dr. West wrote about his son. It's kind of interesting. And this was the case that he wrote about. So there was this case of infantile convulsions. So this was a child who was only 40 days old and had seizures at night, but had many, many, many seizures. And we meet a lot of children. If you remember in Dr. Bell's slide, the number of people who begin having their seizures as children, or certainly as infants. This is not an uncommon presentation. Of course, this history doesn't tell me why. So remember, we were talking about the cause is the most important thing, and that is missing from this. But we certainly knew this was a child who really needed some help. And they did the standard of care at the time with purgatives and warm bath and calomel and chalk and opiates, and they even went all the way to the leeches, which is always worth doing. And that really didn't seem to help out. And then they gave 15 grams of a hemp extract, and they got a really interesting response. They got a very significant sedation, followed though by improvement. And that, in their minds, suggested that maybe this worked. Now, it's hard for me to know exactly. We definitely, as you saw, have a lot of what seem to be benign syndromes in children. Could this simply have been that this child was going to stop anyway, and this was just something else happening at that time? And we don't know about that. This, of course, is not a medical study, but it was definitely something that laid the seeds for some enthusiasm for later on. As you know, cannabis is not new. It's certainly not even new to the U.S. Cannabis has actually been around for a very long time in the U.S. in a legal fashion, actually. It used to be grown as a hemp product and still is actually for industrial use. But it was a major ingredient in a lot of patent medicines, actually, as were some other things that we don't wish to recall. Again, things, opioids and different things of sorts. But around the mid-century, this idea came about that there was danger to the use of things that we didn't know what they were. The FDA came around and said we need to know what's in these products that we're using. And also there was a lot of concern about the international traffic in drugs that could be dangerous. There was actually a huge traffic into China of opium, which had tremendously deleterious effects upon that society at that time. And so this idea that we needed to regulate interstate, international marketing of these agents came about, and leading up to this single convention on narcotic drugs, which again was meant to limit dangerous drugs, but because of a lot of reasons at the time, cannabis was also included in that. And so you see at a very early point for us, cannabis is put in a category of compounds, if you will. I don't even know what to call it therapies, because that category they were put in was a category saying, this is where dangerous compounds live. This is where things live that have the potential to be addictive, potential to be harmful, and have no recognized medical use. And once something is put in there, which is called Schedule 1 of the Comprehensive Drug Control Act, that puts it really out of reach for doing human research in. So right at this point, we lost the ability to do human studies with this compound, or any compounds related to cannabis. And this was anything related to cannabis. It wasn't just whole marijuana at that point. And you can see, though, it certainly didn't stop people from using cannabis, and cannabis continues to be used extensively, and this was numbers even before we saw the big recreational move of maybe a quarter of people in the U.S. using a cannabis product for some wise, and unfortunately 1 in 5 high school students as well. So I think many people in the U.S. have grown up with the perception that this is a drug which is around, it's a recreational compound, it's always been around, so it must be safe. A lot of baggage has come from this on both sides of the issue, I have to say. Not just in terms of the idea that this is a safe thing, but also in terms of this is a dangerous thing. And really our understanding of that has been very difficult to sort out, despite all of our concerns. Now, in the early part of the, late part of the 60s, early part of the 70s, at the National Institutes of Health in Washington, an idea came about saying we don't have enough good medicines for seizures, so we need to look for more. And a large product called the Anticonvulsant Drug Development Program was designed, and the project was saying, let's look at a whole bunch of compounds and see if we can find new things that work for seizures. We need more than just phenobarbital and dilantin and the other things that we had at that point. And interestingly enough, they actually looked at a number of cannabis therapies because this was still accessible to them through some stable reasons. They actually looked at things that were similar to THC, which is one of the cannabinoids that you may know about. And they looked at it first in a lot of animal models. Remember, human research was not possible here. I like some of these animal models. I didn't know that there were epileptic chickens to be able to do research in, but these were all looked at the time, and some positive data was seen at that point. They actually found a compound which was an analog of THC, which they found actually seemed to work better than this, which is dilantin, which was one of the #1 seizure medications at the time. So some hopeful possibilities there. And in addition, they also saw this other cannabinoid called cannabidiol, or CBD, which seemed to have some positive effects in a mouse model. It didn't have the toxicities that were seen with THC as well, which was kind of interesting to note, maybe a positive thing at that point. It didn't have what they call the psychotropic effects, if you will. It didn't make you high, as much as we can understand what that means in a mouse. And so it was known at that point, even in 1973. And so there was some interest at this point. But again, for a lot of reasons, this just simply didn't go forward from there. Now, like with a lot of products that we use for a variety of reasons, whether it's medicines or otherwise, that come from natural sources, well, it's not always as simple as just finding that tree bark and eating the tree bark to get the effect of something that might be in there, right? We try to say, okay, what is within that natural product? If we can find it, that is helpful. What's in there that's not helpful? How can we get just that element and take that alone? And sometimes it's a very difficult thing to figure out. Many natural compounds, I would say most natural products, have numerous compounds within them. Some of them may be helpful, some of them may be harmful, some of them we don't know what the heck they do. How do we sort that out? And certainly within cannabis, there are many, many different compounds that are there that we think are active. This is even just a short list. So how do we begin to break down and say, well, where do we go with all of this stuff? Do we give people the whole thing? Do we give them combinations of these? We end up with a whole bunch of very complicated questions to try to answer, particularly if we're going to do a scientific study on this. And very quickly we come up with things that are just far too big, questions that are simply far too big to answer in our lifetimes. If we would simply ask the question, does cannabis work for epilepsy? If you were trying to develop a study that proved that or disproved that in a reasonable way with significance, you would spend untold lifetimes doing that. So we needed to ask much smaller questions. Like a lot of things, when we're trying to figure out how a compound works within the body, whatever the source might be, we look within the body and say, is there a system that already exists within our bodies that seems to work in a similar way or that might interact with similar compounds as best we understand them? Sometimes we can find compounds within the body that are almost identical to what we're giving from the outside. Sometimes we find things that aren't identical but work in similar kinds of ways. So there is a system within the body called the endocannabinoid system that was thought to maybe be giving us some insight into how cannabis products might work. This is not a perfect comparison. What was found is that this is a system which is widely spread throughout the body, actually. And the major binding sites of these agents are two receptors called CB1 and CB2. CB1 is mostly in the central nervous system. CB2 is actually in the periphery and often in immune cells, which is very interesting. The THC seemed to bind mostly at these CB1 receptors. Cannabinol, which is another cannabinoid, seems to bond more at CB2 receptors, and cannabidiol didn't really seem to bond with either of these, but maybe it affected the activity there. Now, does this mean that we can say that we take an outside compound and say this is the only way it works within the body? No, absolutely not. But this is how we begin to maybe gain insight into how the compounds that we're giving to people might be working within their bodies. We know that there are subsequently a lot of different actions that cannabinoids can have within your body. Sometimes these are good, sometimes not. We know that they can cause impaired memory and cognitive functioning. We know that they can cause slowing of motor function. We know there can be some anti-pain, anti-nausea, or this anti-emetic means anti-vomiting, anti-spasticity, which would be a nice effect, and maybe sleep promoting, that can be good or bad. So these were some ideas about, we know this system is involved in this, maybe we can interact with some of these systems in positive ways with medicines we can get from the outside. We know that this system within the body does interact with things that we know are associated with the balances in seizures, particularly neurotransmitters within our central nervous system that are out of balance, that can either cause seizures or prevent seizures. These are things that actually we try to target when we're giving some of our known anti-seizure medications. So we knew already maybe there was some activity going on there. We didn't know if that was a positive or a negative or both, though. And we knew that there were other pathways that might also be involved. And as you may hear from the news, there's a lot of interest in, is there actually opiate activity, and could we modulate how people's requirements for opiates are currently with some of these products? So a lot of questions, in fact, too many questions at this point. So it became very, very difficult to know how to dive into this. What seemed to come out, though, was this idea that cannabinoids are not all anticonvulsant. And that was really relatively clear right from the start. As soon as we started getting into this, yes, there could be some effect, but not across the board. And certainly with giving a whole plant with all those active compounds in it, we were not going to get necessarily the effect that we wanted. We seem to see that if you increased activity of those receptors, that made something more likely to be an anticonvulsant or an anti-seizure compound. If you decreased activity, that actually seemed to stimulate seizures and might cause seizures to happen. So how do we find the right balance between those two things? Endocannabinoids in general tended to be relatively anticonvulsant. And if you look over here, this actually has to do with the effects on acute seizures and then seizures over the course of one's life. The green is the effect against seizures. The red is actually the effect causing seizures. And we found that some compounds, including the THCs, might actually also stimulate seizures in some people. So it really wasn't as simple as saying, this element does this one does this, and we can break these down and have one effect only. Another question came about, is there a difference in what happens right away versus what happens later? This is an extremely important effect, particularly when we're talking about our kids who are experiencing seizures. One of the first questions I think we all ask as parents or caregivers is, these seizures are happening a lot, we really want to stop them, but is every single seizure hurting my child? Do I really need to stop everything, or can we find a balance in doing that? What if stopping every seizure means actually taking so much medicine that they have all these other effects? What is the harm from that? And we've worried for a long time about what are the effects of active seizures on the developing brain. The longer you have seizures, that seem to make you more likely to have seizures all your life. We do know that the longer you have uncontrolled seizures, the harder it is to make them go away, but is that because the seizures are injuring your brain? There's been a lot of questions about this thing called epileptogenesis, the idea that active seizures can actually create a situation within your brain that makes it very difficult for you to ever outgrow your seizures. And the idea is, can we interfere with that in some way by keeping seizures from causing the damage that they might? And there was a thought that perhaps these compounds could potentially be involved with this. This is a big area of interest, though, because when we focus on seizures, we're also looking at the course of the lifespan, which is as much, if not more important for many of our patients. So because of all this, with all these bans on research and everything else, this is where we were in 2014. This was a review of the literature that we had at that point. We were looking and saying, how do cannabinoids work in human epilepsy? We had 4 studies and a total of 48 patients. So pretty poor. They all were using CBD as the treatment agent. They were really not very well designed studies. They weren't studies you could look at and say, that's good data. They certainly weren't studies you could take to the FDA and say, hey, can we get approval for this to be used? Is this safe? And unfortunately, there was really very limited data on the subject, so we didn't even know what kind of epilepsy these people had. So this was really, it was wrong even to call this data, actually. We had some interest, and we had some evidence that this was being used. And so the conclusion in this paper was that there were no reliable conclusions that could be drawn. And we, of course, needed more information. And this is what our talks have been for a long time. We need more data. And while that still is the case, we've been beginning to get some of that data, and it's been quite interesting. Why did we need to do this? Because why didn't we just let this kind of stop here? Okay, maybe there's nothing here, yada, yada, whatever. Well, because in the meantime, everybody else was galloping ahead. Public perception of whether cannabis worked in a variety of conditions, epilepsy included, was really quite strong. So here's the Oregon Medical Marijuana Program, and the data, this is from last year to this year. You can get this every year. This is a list of conditions for which one may obtain a medical marijuana card. You can have one or more of these conditions that will allow you then to obtain a card from the state. You could have several of these, if you will. So this is the breakdown for the conditions. And seizures was definitely on here. It wasn't number 1, but you see, maybe only about 2-3% or so. Most people were receiving this for an indication of pain. Most people receiving this were actually, well, men more than women, certainly. And a lot of things about how we designed this program have set up reasons for us to be skeptical about what it really is for. And can we take data from this program and make medical sense of it, particularly with regard to particular conditions? You might say, well, pain is actually one of the most difficult symptoms to actually objectively assess. How do you know if somebody really is better from a pain standpoint? And if you look across the nation in terms of the epidemiology of pain, who experiences pain more than anybody else? Well, actually, women experience pain more than men, and women older in their lives. So why are the main people getting marijuana for pain in our state young males? So this led to a lot of skepticism that maybe this really wasn't all about medical use, and maybe there was more to this, and kept us from being able to say, this is data we can take and make good sense of moving forward. What was really interesting, remember on that last one, that was all patients in the study. If we look at patients just under 18, seizures are all of a sudden number 1. So there was this perception that was going forward saying, actually, the idea that seizures could work for children more than adults is a public perception. People really believe this for some reason. Why is that? And actually, the listing of these conditions is worded so vaguely that seizures might actually be part of this. So if you look, so seizures in this case, 43% of patients. If you include neurological problems in that, many of which might include seizures, you're up to 60% of kids under the age of 18 were receiving medical marijuana for that indication. So a huge and very specific perception that cannabis was effective for seizures. So where did this come from? I mean, this has been the thing all along. We have this medical marijuana program. We have all this press going on. There's tremendous enthusiasm on the internet, elsewhere. We have laws in certain states. We even did at this point, we had laws that were specific to the use of cannabinoids, particularly cannabidiol, in childhood seizures. Well, you look at that and you say, well, there must be good data behind that, right? Because everybody's approving this. We came up with this list a long time ago, and seizures is on every state's medical marijuana list, so there must be some data behind it. And there wasn't. And this really led to this misperception that we knew things that we didn't at this point. So it wasn't to say, well, there's nothing that we can learn from this. The question was simply, how do we begin to learn about this? So where do we start? Collecting people's experiences, people's stories, people's anecdotes does not unfortunately result in what we would want to call good quality data, unfortunately. It's not that they're lying or that we can't trust them, it's just that that is not the kind of thing that we want to base our studies upon. I think that people rely upon their caregivers for it. Unfortunately, as we were saying before, good research unfortunately sometimes has to start at really small questions. If you're going to get the answer that you want, you have to start somewhere. And sometimes that's not the question that's going to lead to the answer that you want. You want to know more than that, but you have to start somewhere. And so choosing exactly where to start was a very difficult thing, but I think a very wise thing in the end of where we've gotten so far. The other thing that's very important is that, because a lot of this work was done as clinical research studies, and a lot of people were very anxious to do this because there was this perception that cannabis would work, and certainly better than all these other poisons you were giving me for my seizures, right? And yet this led to this dilemma. Clinical research is working with unknowns to find out if they could be effective. Can we actually allow people to take their children off of other medicines and try this out? Is that ethical? Those other things may not work as well as we want them to, and they may have other toxicities that we know about, but we also know that they can work against seizures, and we haven't proven that with this yet. And so that was a big dilemma at the time. Telling people, this is not a substitute for what we know of, for established medical care at that point. And this is extremely important because in our population, we're talking not about using this ourselves as consenting adults. We're talking about using this for our children, and for our children with a very significant medical issue. How ethical is that? And do we as physicians actually need to restrict people in doing this? So this was a big thing. The other big issue is that we all love our kids, and we really, really want them to do well. And we sure don't want them to have more suffering in their lives, and certainly not seizures. And because of that, often our perception of how they're doing can be not purely objective. But maybe our feelings for them can also help them in different ways. So this is not all a bad thing. Whether you call it placebo effect, something which is negative, is really up to you, but it's real. We just simply have to acknowledge it. Okay? We all have positive expectations about how things are going on. It's not just parents and caregivers, but it's also the physicians as well. They're looking, we want to help you too. We also know that if you really believe something is going to work, it actually does physiologically change your body. So was this just about the cannabis? So we have to be careful about that. Were we actually going to be fooling ourselves into thinking that this thing we were so enthusiastic about was helpful when maybe it really wasn't? Sometimes we run into trouble with how the studies are done as well. Hey, if I can give you access to a cannabis product that is unique, and I'm going to follow you for this, and I can give it to you for free, if you're in this study, well, you should want to be in that study rather than spending a tremendous amount of money maybe at some other source for that. So there's a lot of reasons to say, I really want to be part of this, so I'm going to keep kind of going along, not in a dishonest kind of way, but that certainly was a desire that was there. Other issues that came up of when we're looking at a study that's recording seizures, and particularly maybe in our children having seizures, how do we know we're counting the right things? What if we're looking at staring spells? How do we count staring spells or body jerks? So we have to say, are these studies really counting what they think they are? The other thing is that we know over the course of one's life with epilepsy, or even over the course of a year or a month, there's normal fluctuations in things. You may have more seizures at one time and less at another, and there may be a reason you know why that happens, or there may not be a reason that happens. So if we do a study that captures 3 months of your life, what if your epilepsy was simply on a downswing during those months? Maybe it would lead us to believe that that was caused by the treatment we were doing. That's called regression to the mean. Over time, everybody has these fluctuations, so we didn't want to be fooled by that as well. This comes up with all kinds of studies doing, not just for epilepsy, and certainly not just for cannabis, but these are all important considerations because of all the baggage, if you will, the cultural baggage on both sides that comes with this issue. So let's try to get into the data. So the first thing that came out was this. The Stanford parents are, and I know Stanford beat the Ducks a couple months ago, but I'm still going to talk about it. And so this was a paper, if you will, so something that was describing 18 patients, eventually was published. And this was looking at the use of cannabidiol. Now this was not just cannabidiol, this was a variety of cannabis products which contained cannabidiol, but people felt that overall, maybe this was the doses that their kids were getting. And many of these kids had Dravet syndrome, but many of them also had very difficult other epilepsy syndromes as well. They had many drug failures and intractable epilepsy risks. This was not people just starting out with seizures. This was people that had really tough epilepsy to start with. A huge number of these patients were reported as having improvement. 83% had seizure reduction. That's more than I've seen in any other study that I'm aware of, in any other anticonvulsant. And it was not just that, it was improved sleep and improved mood and alertness, and none of the other problems that were being seen with other medicines that were being used at that time. So I thought, wow, this is really pretty impressive, isn't it? Let's move forward with this. Unfortunately, it turned out this really wasn't the study. This was a Facebook group that one of the authors had with parents caring for kids with a variety of seizure types and said, what's your experience with this so far? So again, nice information, but again, a collection more of anecdotes than real data overall. But what's followed then began to be the real thing. So the first step was actually looking at just cannabidiol alone, so pharmaceutical grade purified cannabidiol, so no other cannabinoids within this, that was made available through a program that allowed us to import medication or receive medications that were not approved in the US to be used in a certain number of patients. So 11 epilepsy centers in the US were involved in this. This was called compassionate use IND. So if you have a very serious medical condition and your practitioner wishes to get you a medication that is not available in the US, you can apply to the FDA and get this permission. So this is essentially what happened. And this medication was provided by a company that was in the UK at the time called GW Pharma that made purified cannabidiol, which they were calling Epidiolex, and they still are. So what happened? Well, people seemed to do well with it, but they did well at really, really high doses, much higher than anybody had known about before, really. Most of these patients were getting 50 milligrams per kilogram per day, and a significant number of them required that to get a benefit. If you look at what most people were getting through the dispensary systems, if you could believe what it said on the bottles, most people are getting maybe 2 per kilo per day, or maybe 5 per kilo. So this is very different. And the mean dose that most people stayed on after the study was still pretty significant, maybe 30 per kilo per day. These are big doses. So was this the real information? Finally, hey, did you really actually need these bigger doses to get the benefits? That was an interesting question, and this was a very nice observation and written out quite well. Not a randomized, blinded study, though. This was just, we're going to give you this medication and you let us know what happens. The benefit of this, though, was that this was done at medical centers. So number one, we knew who these patients are. We knew that they had seizures. We knew what kind of seizures they had, and we could objectively follow them in certain ways. So we had better baseline information about these folks to believe that we could learn a little bit more, but not the kind of study that we really wanted. This is what happened within that, though. This is improvement in seizures. Even became seizure-free. But there were a significant number of people that really didn't benefit from this at all, and actually worsened. This is worsening of seizures in a significant number of folks. And you might argue, when does this become a meaningful thing? If you have 200 seizures a week and I reduce that to 100, that's a 50% reduction. That sounds pretty good, right? Is that really meaningful? So this is what we have to consider a lot when we're looking at seizure outcomes here overall. If you have 2 seizures a year and that keeps you from being able to drive and hold a certain job and it affects your life in a certain way, and I reduce that to 1 seizure a year, is that really a game changer? It's a 50% reduction. That's pretty good from a research standpoint. So this has to also be considered. This was not a perfect therapy. So why didn't we just start doing a lot of these studies, right? I mean, we got this idea that this could be working. Let's just go out there and start getting this data all together. Well, it's actually really hard to, and it was at that point, still is for many reasons, to start a clinical trial looking at cannabis. You had to partner with industry, which was fine, but there really were not very many companies that were making products available to do. You could use that compassionate use IND, which means applying to the government, and that's actually a long process to do. Or you could start a study yourself. That's called investigator-initiated, where you say, I'm going to come up with this issue, I have this question, I'm going to design this alone. Well, that's actually kind of hard too. You have to find somebody who's going to help pay for that, who's going to buy the products for people. And you also have to figure out where you're going to get your marijuana from. You can't just go to the dispensary and get it, unfortunately. That's not as easy as it seems. Actually, if you want to do a study using cannabis that's legal in the US, you have to apply and get a product from these people who have been the growers of cannabis products for the last 50 years, I think. Does anybody know where this is?
Mississippi.
Mississippi, that's right, somebody knows out there. So this is a field which has been grown for many years, and it really has one strain of cannabis that's been grown within there. And this has been a strain of cannabis which has been grown there for many years. There are many strains of this product, as you may know, and things have changed significantly over time. Is this really the best way to learn about what we're interested in? And actually, they were only giving out maybe about 4 projects a year that they were approving to do this, to get cannabis from these folks. So many barriers to doing this. You couldn't just say, this is an interesting question, my patients are very interested in this, I need to know more about this, let's do a study. And believe me, there were many people that would approach me from different industries within the state, growers, dispensaries, saying, hey, we have this great stuff, we got to do a study together, I want to do it. And we have a group together that wants to study this in families. And that just wasn't possible. There were many legal barriers to that. I work at an institution that receives some federal funding, actually. They were very concerned at OHSU, saying, hey, if we start doing research with a product that we're not getting federal approval for, could we actually lose our federal funding for that? Could I actually lose my DEA license, which comes from the federal government as well, which would keep me from being able to prescribe a lot of medications that my patients needed? So there's a lot of barriers and concern about what to do with this. So how would we go about getting this? So we partnered with industry, and when we do this, this often leads to some very good research. We have to also be aware, though, of what our goals are overall, and our research partners are, I've got Tim, I'm going to move along, I promise. Our research partners have their goals, and we have ours, and they're not necessarily different goals, we just have to be aware of that when we do studies together. And when we partner, of course, we participate in studies that we think are good studies and that our research boards approve of. So these are not promotional things. So GW Pharma, which is now called Greenwich Biosciences in the US, was making 2 products at the time. One was called Sativex, which was a spray 50-50 THC and CBD that they found to be effective in some patients with spasticity due to multiple sclerosis. This was not available in the US, and actually at this point, they weren't actually making this available to anybody. Epidiolex, though, was the cannabidiol preparation, and that's what we began to use. And a lot of folks were using this as well, different epilepsy centers, through multi-center studies to look at a couple different conditions. And the initial conditions that were looked at were Dravet syndrome and Lennox-Gastaut syndrome. Why? That's a good question. Why not seizures of all sorts? We get most medications that come to us, they're looked at first in adults with focal seizures. We know what to do with that information. Well, what are we going to do with information that's based upon these syndromes? Are we going to take that and apply it to everybody else who has epilepsy? Insys Therapeutics is a US company that makes a synthetic cannabidiol molecule. They try to make it as much like the naturally derived product as they can. Remember, we're talking about only the molecule here. So maybe it really doesn't matter if all those other things in a natural product aren't there and it's just a molecule. We can make that in the lab, it's cheaper. We don't have to have all of these huge fields. I don't even know where these are. Do you know where they are?
In the UK.
They're in the UK. These are in undisclosed locations, actually, all around the UK. GW is growing a tremendous amount of cannabis for there, because this is a very expensive thing to do, of course. And so developing these products, it would be much easier just to make them up in the lab, right? But now we actually start to see some real data. So this is actually published in the New England Journal of Medicine, which is one of our premier medical journals. And this was looking at 120 kids with Dravet syndrome. And this was, again, another multi-center study. They used 20 per kilo per day. So not those 50 per kilo doses, but still pretty darn high relative to what people were getting in the open market. And a 50% seizure reduction was seen in a significant number of kids, certainly over placebo. Not everybody was cured, believe me. And you might say, well, what does a 50% seizure reduction really even mean, right? It looks good on paper, but again, remember, if it's 2 to 1, that may not mean anything to you. It may still keep you from being functioning. If it's from 200 to 100, is that meaningful? So think about what these numbers really mean, right? Some people did become seizure-free, but it was not a large amount, and that was only people who were receiving therapy as well, nobody with placebo. So this was felt to be a positive study. The side effects that were seen were primarily diarrhea, decreased appetite, okay, and sleepiness. There was then a second study that was done looking at Lennox-Gastaut syndrome. You heard a little bit about that earlier this morning. Again, using similar doses, 20 milligrams per kilogram per day compared to placebo. I should mention, these studies were done the way that we wanted to see studies done. They were randomized, what we call randomized double-blinded controlled studies, which means that if you went into that study, you were randomized to a treatment. It could be a medicine, it could be a high dose, a middle dose, it could be a placebo. You're not getting medicine at all, but you might think you are. And you don't know what you're getting, and the person that's caring for you doesn't know what you're getting. So there's no bias that might sneak in that way. That's the kind of thing that we want to see a study do. This also showed a decrease in Lennox-Gastaut patients in both drop and total seizures. And drop seizures, drop attacks for people with Lennox-Gastaut are probably the most difficult kind of seizures. And so often we focus on those because we say if we can change nothing else about your epilepsy, if we can keep you having those seizures that make you fall down and break your nose and chip your teeth, that would be ideal, even if we can't stop you having the other types. Again, diarrhea was the most significant side effect. And this is comparing the low dose, or this is comparing that dosage to placebo, and then as the people continued on the dose, that effect seemed to be preserved over time. A second study was also done, again in the New England Journal, looking at comparing dosages here. And they found that they actually could use a lower dose, but the high dose was still pretty effective. And this was focusing just on drop seizures. So some very good data initially saying that this could be an anticonvulsant, cannabidiol alone, in these conditions, Dravet syndrome and Lennox-Gastaut syndrome. Well, there you go. What are you going to do with that? Well, it was actually used to move things forward, and this is just this year, actually, right? And you guys remember, in April, the FDA Advisory Board, which is the board that actually makes recommendations to the FDA about whether they should move forward with a therapy, unanimously recommended that the FDA consider this for approval. A big government hearing, very passionate, like a lot of government hearings seem to be, and that was moved forward. There's a really quite remarkable thing that people saw, and actually that led then subsequently to FDA approval for this. And they said, great, give me my Epidiolex today, but that wasn't possible. We needed to wait then for the DEA to take it out of that Schedule 1 category so it would be something we could actually prescribe. And that actually just happened on the 27th of September. And they brought it from Schedule 1 down to Schedule 5, which is the lowest scheduling level. So similar to Tylenol with codeine, for instance. The indication, though, was for, again, seizures associated with Dravet syndrome and Lennox-Gastaut syndrome in patients over 2 years of age. Again, you keep hearing me say this, but where does this lead to overall? And this was some of the data that was associated with it, there were certain news stories. And this is a picture of us the other day writing our first prescription, actually. So, what does this mean? What does efficacy in these syndromes really mean for people that don't have Dravet or Lennox-Gastaut? Is this an across-the-board therapy? We just chose to look at those because that was the small question we had to ask. Who's going to be able to get this stuff? What if you don't have those conditions? Will you be able to receive a prescription for this? Will your insurance company pay for it? I mean, there's a lot of important things that we don't know just yet. I was particularly worried that the incidence of Lennox-Gastaut and Dravet syndrome in the Northwest was suddenly going to skyrocket. All of a sudden, everybody's got these things. It's kind of worrisome. And the other thing was, what about all the other cannabis products that are out there? And this is a really important question here. Should you take this information, the fact that these high dosages of CBD were found to be effective, and try to do that yourself with available products? And the answer to that is no. And this was a difficult thing, because often when we're doing research, we learn something about a compound or a therapy. We say, if we're seeing this in the research, I've heard about this, we have access to that through other means. Maybe that medicine's already on the market for other reasons. Let's start using it in a similar fashion. This was not possible for a lot of reasons. One of them simply being that the system we set up to make cannabis products available to people, whether for recreational or so-called medical use, we were not regulating it at that time. We still aren't really to a large degree. We were regulating it like we regulate supplements, which basically means not at all. So when you got that bottle that said it had X amount of cannabinoids of different sorts within it, you had no way of verifying that, of course. It's actually really expensive and very difficult to make a product that has just one cannabinoid in it. And it's very difficult to measure that as well. So we were having a lot of products that we had access to, which were expensive, but also had very low amounts of these cannabinoids in them, and we didn't know what they were. So if you were to try to give 20 per kilo per day of cannabidiol to somebody, you would not only spend a fortune trying to get that much, because you'd be giving a huge amount of the product from the dispensary, but you'd also be giving a large amount of all those other things that are in there too, THC, other cannabinoids, so you would end up with a very difficult situation, and not something that could really even be compared to what happened in the study. So unfortunately, we had something that was different from what could be tried outside. You needed to be doing this. So the question was, well, where do we go from here? What about all the other cannabinoids? We got CBD through the market, but what if we were using a product that had THC? What would the FDA say about that? Would the DEA allow THC to be descheduled? That's a very different thing, right? We're not talking about a medication that doesn't seem to have any addictive properties or any psychoactive properties. Can we just do this locally? What about all these people growing cannabis? Why can't we do that? And how can we maintain, if we are going to do these studies, how can we keep doing good studies overall? I have just a few more slides, and I'm trying not to race through these. This was a panel that Kate Brown put together a couple of years ago to try to say, how can we begin to do this within our state? We have a huge industry within our state of Oregon that is from seed to weed, or whatever they say. Basically, it's people that are growing cannabis, people that are making products from this, and people that are using these products. How do we do the research here, if we can, to be able to find that out? So a task force came together and said, let's actually create an institute within the state called the Oregon Institute for Cannabis Research that could actually sponsor this kind of research within the state, and looking at a lot of different things here overall. And this is something which is now in process. This is not cannabis, this is actually the carpet at the State House in Sandhurst. Another thing that came out of this was saying, should we actually go back and look at the medical marijuana program and say, this is not one size fits all. We have a lot of kids that are getting products through this. Should we actually be monitoring those kids differently from how we monitor adults? Should we require you only to check in with your doctor once a year to keep your prescription filled, or should it be more than that? And who should that doctor be? Should that be a doc in the box who you pay $300 to and signs your marijuana card, or should that be somebody that knows you? And what's the role of that person going forward? So a lot of concern about how we can make things a little bit more safer for our kids, and also consider the risk of other things within cannabis that we know could be harmful, like THC. We've been involved in a couple different studies, and we continue to look at what are called phase 3 studies now, using these compounds, again, in a variety of different conditions right now. These are active studies that are going on right now. And they've been very interesting experiences. The biggest problem with these, if I have to say anything, is that telling people that they couldn't be in them because they didn't have these conditions, or they had other elements that kept them from being eligible, or it just wasn't the right thing for them to be in a study. And there were so many people that wanted this, and unfortunately having to pick and choose on some level became very difficult. I know many centers had lotteries, if you can believe that, for allowing people to participate in these studies. So these questions still remain. Who should authorize medical cannabis for kids? Should it be anybody? Should it be a certain kind of practitioner? Should it be a specialist? What proof of safety and efficacy do we need going forward to show this really is helpful over time? So we can know that this, yes, this is still a meaningful therapy for somebody. Should we change those listed medical conditions on there? Should we drop some of them off? Should we make them more specific when we're talking about the medical marijuana program? And as I was kind of alluding to before, can the current marketplace, as it's set up right now, support this going forward? We have taken a system that we set up for different reasons than making medicine. And we're trying to use that, people have been trying for some time to use that to get medicines, and not medicines for themselves, but for their kids. And maybe that system is just not one that we can really continue to adapt to get in a good and safe and sustainable situation. So, that was a lot, and I apologize. This talk was initially supposed to be on cannabis and other therapies, and I realized very quickly that we should probably just focus on this, so I apologize. I didn't get to all of these other things, which actually we should come back and do another talk on, because there's a lot of other really cool stuff going on in epilepsy care that is not cannabis related, and I hate to have our focus be only on this alone. So remember this slide, lots of really cool things, some of which you can learn about outside here, much of which you can read about in the news and the medical literature. So thank you all for your attention. I'd be happy to answer questions. I know I'm out of time. We're going into lunch, is that right? We have a few minutes for questions, actually. Oh, good. We have good time for questions. And again, I think at the end of the program, again, there'll be more time for questions. Okay. Well, again, thank you very much. Are there questions that I can answer?
So I have a question about the buildup in the neurons of the drug. And I'm not sure exactly what drug it is that builds up and stays in the nerves, as opposed to like alcohol, the liver flushes out. Am I correct in this?
Well, I don't know that it's toxicity that's accumulated over time so much. Actually, I'm going to answer your question a little bit in a different way. What I really worry about over time with exposing kids to cannabis therapies is the simple fact that kids are not just little adults. And we know that the way therapies of all sorts behave in kids are different. And that children's nervous systems are also different. And their expression of all of these receptors are different. And we know that a system that exists within the body, like the endocannabinoid system, is there for a reason, right? It's there because it's involved in lots of, and it's actually involved in a lot of very important things having to do with normal development. Endocannabinoids are actually expressed in breast milk, and they're there for a good reason because they help promote suckling and feeding. And if we take that out of breast milk, rat pups don't eat and they fail to thrive. So we know that these things are there for a reason. What if we go and start tweaking that system early on? We know that actually endocannabinoids have a lot to do with brain development actually early on, how the neurons organize themselves. Could we actually interfere with a normal process by trying to help something with somebody else? So it's really a very important question about early exposures to these. And chronic exposures certainly have a concern as well, but that's been my focus. How can we assume what's going to happen the younger and younger we go with this therapy?
Have you seen any data on the variability in labeling on products and what the actual concentration is?
Yeah, every year actually the FDA goes around and for a variety of different compounds collects a lot of products that are on the market. And this includes things that are being sold locally, things you can get on the web, things you can get from other countries, etc. And says, let's measure these things and see how well they compare to what they say that they are. This is a really important system, guys. We rely upon this system every day. We rely upon the fact you can go to the pharmacy and buy ibuprofen, and it says 200 milligrams in a tablet, and you can pretty much rely upon the fact there's going to be 200 milligrams of ibuprofen in that. And if there's 2,000, somebody's to blame for that, and you can go complain about that. And that's a system we've set up. It's not a cheap system, but it's a good system, and we rely upon that. And so the FDA continues to look around and say, hey, are there people that are not following these rules? And every year, unfortunately, many of the cannabis products, particularly the ones available online, tend to misrepresent what's in their therapies. And whether this is because they just don't have the wherewithal to be able to really test them, or whether they really are misrepresenting them, is difficult to know. And I know this happens a lot over time as well with many of the dispensaries, where we see variable effects over time. Somebody keeps going and thinking they're getting the same product over time, but the effect changes. Maybe it's short-lived, or maybe it comes and goes. Does that mean that the product is changing over time? Somebody's growing it, they're making it, maybe they only have 100 patients. Is that really enough of a system to make something consistent? So I guess the answer to your question is no. There's been significant concern about variability in things, and whether, particularly among the recreational products, over suggesting how much THC is in them, for instance. But also inconsistencies, particularly with products that are sourced locally. So it's not a system that is really set up to give us medicine in the way that we'd like to have it, as it exists now.
Thank you, Dr. Roberts.
So thank you all very much.